Today is the last lecture in the series, Architecture in the Modern Era. And for today, I'll be presenting my own work, which includes my education, which was meant for last lecture we didn't get into, but I've got a little bit of that today. And then going into my architectural practice, which is just past 20 years now of working in residential design. And much like Kiesler that we spoke about, I believe the family unit to be the smallest cohesive unit of design. So that's one of the reasons why I limit myself just to residential work. But before I begin, I'd like to, of course, thank you for attending these lectures, this course. It's been a great thrill to present all this information to you, and I hope that I was able to provide something of benefit. So to begin, last summer when I was preparing the syllabus for this series, I gave a copy of it to a friend of mine, Arthur Lubetz, who teaches architecture at CMU. And over lunch, we discussed his thoughts on the class and what things I could improve on. And he had lots of great feedback for me. But one thing that stuck out to me as he was reading through the syllabus, same syllabus with some changes, of course, to the one I gave you earlier. But on the back side, I had a brief bio on myself, and he asked me the question at the top of the bio where I called myself a residential architect as opposed to just an architect. And he asked me the question, he says, why do I do that? You know, why do I limit myself to just calling myself a residential architect? And that kind of stuck with me, that question. And so today's lecture is actually trying to answer that question. And hopefully by the time that we're done here, you'll have a sense of why I just limit myself to residential work. If not, raise your hand and I can elaborate in a little bit more literal way. So in undergraduate school, I attended the Ohio State University in the School of Architecture in the late 80s. And at the time, two individuals, Jeffrey Kipnis and Peter Eisenman, were both teaching there, and they were theorists as much as they were architects. And one of the concepts that they were developing at the time was a concept called event structure, or another term that they threw around was weak form, weak, W-E-A-K. And this concept related to having a structure or form that is designed in such a way that it encourages unexpected juxtapositions. So as an example, even though this lecture hall is designed for lectures, in their mind, architecture should be moving in a direction where the space and the form is designed in such a way that other activities might spontaneously or unexpectedly develop in this space, not just the function that was planned for this space, which are lectures. And so that was their concept of weak form. Form being so weak in style or in shape or in design that it afforded the opportunity for other things to happen other than just what it was designed for. And so this concept, one of the reasons it appealed to them was because it afforded what they thought in their mind, and which I agree with, is that more creativity to naturally flow into the design, because creativity involves these kind of unexpected juxtapositions that frequently happen between a context and a new context that pairs with it. So, seeking a more firmer grasp on the articulation and the visual perception of form, I went to graduate school at Pratt Institute in the early 1990s, and I sought Pratt out for a number of reasons, but two of the main reasons was, one, at the time there was a gentleman there teaching by the name of John Johansson, and he was considered one of the what they called the Harvard Five. And this was a group of 5 individuals that were at Harvard in the 1940s. And they were architects, designers, and John was kind of one of the leaders of the pack. And he studied architecture under Marcel Breuer, who at the time was teaching at Harvard. And he, of course, was a kind of a disciple of the Bauhaus movement back in Germany before they immigrated to the States. And so I was very much interested in this approach that the Bauhaus was teaching as far as their approach to design, form, and space. And so I sought John out specifically, and he had a lot of parallels, his work that he designed, to Frederick Kiesler that we've been studying the last couple of weeks in not only the forms that he created, but also the ideologies behind them. But more importantly than John, there was 2 other professors that were teaching there at the time, one by the name of William Fogler, and the other one by the name of Martin Skalski. And these 2 individuals were in the industrial design department. And that was primarily why I selected Pratt over a number of other schools to pursue, is because in my opinion at the time, the industrial designers had a methodology for design, a form that was superior to what they were teaching in architecture. And so with my kind of interest in understanding how form is perceived, how it's designed, and the implications that it has on the individuals that inhabit it, I really wanted to learn from these 2 professors at Pratt teaching in the industrial design department. They were doing what they referred to as a phenomenological scene, where they would focus on the way a space feels when you inhabit it, and the way that the thresholds and the envelopes that are created by the forms of the space, and really tuning into not only a mental response, but even a tactile bodily response to the space. And that was really the thrust of a way of designing industrial design that, from its inception at Pratt, they were a couple of professors that were just carrying on a tradition that came along before them, but they still are pioneers in their own right within the field. So in that regard, when I started my thesis work in graduate school, I juxtaposed these 2 images because I was interested in really exploring, again, these gestures and form and how they speak to an inhabitant that's in the space. And so, as much like body language, when the act of laying down or the act of standing up both have different implications in how it speaks to someone that sees you in various positions in body. Body language is a science that's well known, but that can be applied to architectural space and architectural form as well. And very much the gestures of the forms and the way they are articulated can speak as well in a language of design and perception. So my thesis, which was titled Gestured Forms and Activated Space, which was completed in 1994, was essentially all that I had kind of learned from Pratt, which was an investigative research study into the visual perception of architectural space and exploring kind of the proximic relationships between the inhabitant and the inhabitable form. So One of the techniques that Martin Skalski taught in his industrial design program class was using these models out of chipboard or cardboard and creating surfaces that would represent in scale form a wall surface, and then small scaled figures that would represent people, and creating kind of like this environment where you would place these walls and these surfaces, and you would look to the relationship between the individual occupying that space, and then taking those wall surfaces and adjusting them, or making what he called refinements, and trying to refine the space to engage the occupant in the space in whatever type of relationship you're trying to engage them in. But what they would make refinements kind of what was considered an improved condition. And so, like in this example here, there's the original condition and then the improved condition, where this wall stays in place, the two figures stay in place, and this wall shifts back to further back than where it is in the original condition. So over here are two little floor plan sketches that kind of visualize the sense of space that he was trying to get the students to see visually in their mind's eye. And so you have the two surface forms, and you have the two scale figures that are standing in the space, and then you have these bubbles that enclose or define the space. This bubble here in front is defined by this shape here, which extends down and includes the individual standing right on the edge of that bubble. And then this larger bubble that's defined by the larger form in the back here. And so these bubbles are what were conceived as thresholds or envelopes of the space. It's kind of like the perimeter. So in this particular situation where you have these two forms, if this individual stepped over here outside of the bubble, they would in theory perceive a perceptual difference, that they had stepped outside of the space. Much like in the lecture hall here where we have the doors, once you pass through that threshold of the door, you immediately register that you have exited the lecture hall, and then and vice versa. Where you have open space like this, it's a lot less, it's more nuanced, and it's a lot less visually defined, but nonetheless, it's still there. And that concept and that perception of space and thresholds is really what we try to explore in his classes. And so then down below here is another drawing of this model to the left, and this shows by moving this one form further back into the space, it compresses the bubble in the backside. By doing so, now this individual would feel outside of the bubble, and then this bubble in the front moves forward following this form, and again the individual in the front is outside of that bubble. So by moving this space, this would then move the occupants of the space perceptually outside of the space defined by these two walls. And so if that's your intent, then that would be considered an improved condition. If your intent is to not move them outside but actually reinforce that feeling, then that would be a defect. And so we would be this constant play back and forth of moving the objects within the space, moving the individuals within the space, and playing with them in model form until we could perceive the optimum configuration for whatever our objective is. So after going through a series of these studies, my thesis was to select a location on campus to create a full-scale model to test the theories out with actual individuals and actual people in the space. And so I selected the lobby, the entry hall to the president's office on campus, and I installed 4 forms, gestured forms I refer to them, in the space, suspended from the ceiling, so they're up above, out from obstructing your movement through the space, but they still, in theory, which was what I was testing, is how they would affect you visually and your movement through the space. And so I used 2 forms, This one here, which is adjacent to the elevator that takes you up to the upper floors. And then this other form here that was suspended right over the front entry here to the lobby. And this is the installed condition. And then the second condition, this piece was dropped down about 4 inches. So it's a very subtle adjustment to see how that impacts the use of the space. And then the other form, which was next to the elevator, this is the installed condition. And then this was lowered on the wall in the same location on that corner, but it was lowered about 8 inches. So again, very, very subtle adjustments, but the goal was to study the impacts of the individuals. So this is the floor plan of the entry lobby. This is the front door, and the president's office was over here. These were a set of stairs that went up and a set of stairs that went down. Here's the elevator that goes up and down. And then off to the left was an entry into a gallery space that was used for showing student work. So in the course of the study, once these forms were installed, these dotted lines here represent the forms overhead. This is the larger one. Here's the one over the entry that was adjusted. Here's one in the corner that was stayed fixed. And then this is the one next to the elevator that was adjusted up and down. These lines are movement patterns through the space. And so when they were installed, I recorded the movement patterns through the space through videos. This was pre-digital era. And I recorded 27 different movement patterns through the space, which ranged everything from as simple as coming in the door to the president's office to people going down the stairs, turning around, coming down, or not only movements through the room, but also I also recorded stationary movement where people would come in and they would push the button for the elevator, and while they were waiting for the elevator to arrive, they would move about the space for, maybe they would look overhead and check out the things I had installed. But whenever they would stop a movement for a period of time, I would record with a dot where that stoppage was. And so there's movement patterns through the space as well as standing patterns, I call them, within the space. And so then this is the before condition, and then after condition, after the pieces were moved, this is the after condition. I'll flip back here a couple times. And you can see that the concentration of people that's in the before condition here is relatively dispersed through the space. They became a little bit more concentrated in front of the elevators. And so one of the goals of these forms was to try to concentrate the people closer to the elevators, so that way the movement through the space, you didn't have people moving through and then this kind of conflict where they would have to step aside and let people around and pass them through. And so it was a very simple goal of trying to make the space more efficient for movement through the space. And so this was the results from that, which showed that the forms did have some influence over how the space was used. But more interestingly than the actual study was the discussion that resulted from the review when I was presenting my thesis. And there was quite a heated debate between some of the jurors on the review between the role of the architect. And because this was clearly intended to be a study to study the movement and the reaction to space and use kind of like a scientific approach to designing form and designing space, much like what Kiesler was proposing in the previous lectures. Some individuals felt that that was not the role of the architect to be a scientist. It was more the role of an architect was an individual that was imposing their own subjectivity, much the way that Wright would approach his form of design, in contrast to Kiesler. And so there were these kind of two sides that were taken, and quite a bit of exchange went back and forth to the merits of both. And that for me was more fascinating to kind of be a part of, because it obviously posed questions for myself. What's my role going forward when, as a student wanting to become an architect? Am I a scientist that's going to study space in a scientific way, the way Kiesler was proposing, or more of an individualist like Frank Lloyd Wright?
I have a question.
Yes.
Is this of, art installations in museums and such, so that patterns could be, people could be directed in a certain direction, to go see certain works of art before other works of art?
Right. No, absolutely. So it's a very good question. So yes, to answer your question, there's curators that put together art shows in galleries and museums are very aware of those ideas as far as how the exhibit will unfold for the viewer as they come through, and very much are interested in trying to control that unfolding of how they experience the pieces individually, but also how in sequence from one to the next. And so, those are definitely things. In fact, my wife, if you were to ask her after so many years of marriage, would tell you that one of the things that's annoying about me when we go out into public spaces is when I'm constantly pointing out poor design, in that they have to have a large sign that says go here, or open this, as opposed to design that's done well, where you don't need a visual sign that says go here. You just naturally go there because the design is in such a way that it draws you in, or it draws you through. And so in my mind, would be better, not to say that there's good and bad, but it would be improved design, because then you don't need signage for every language that exists. I mean, any individual can come into that space and they know where to go without having to read a sign that they might even not be literate. So for that, that sake alone, it makes sense.
Do you do this with every aspect of your life? So not only spatial in rooms, but like with your clothes,
So my wife would probably say yes, but I would probably say no. So it's I guess it's subjective. But that said, it's I'm German Swiss heritage, and that's definitely that scientific rational approach is very part of that ethnic group, and so I would not be surprised if that's the way I approach it. I will say in our house, my clothes are far more organized than my wife's clothes. And she'll admit to that. That's not like a knock on her. So it's...
Like the adventure dressing, you see it as a routine. It's to be going
Right. Yeah, I guess Einstein was known for wearing not the same clothes, but the same style clothes day after day after day, because he had multiple suits of the same. And, I can definitely... appreciate that. So in 2007, there was a 40-year retrospective hosted at MoMA in New York City of Richard Serra's work. And I attended the exhibit, and it was the two pieces in particular, which he called torqued torus inversions. Caught my eye, and they were these are photographs here. The one piece is here on the right, and the other piece here is lower here on the side. These were interesting to me because he was dealing with a lot of these ideas and concepts that I was dealing with in school, in the industrial design department at Pratt, as far as how form affects you as you move in and about and through the pieces. If any of you are familiar with Richard Serra's work, as you move about through his spaces and his pieces, he's very much interested in the inhabitants' reaction to it.
I think I just read the plaque yesterday outside of the Carnegie Museum Park where the water fountain is. There's one of the
Right, exactly. The large, tall tower, the square shape is one of his pieces. That's
What's the name again?
Richard Serra, Serra. So this is steel, what's called cortence, because it rusts as it oxidizes. It's these what he calls ellipses, because in plan they're elliptical shape. These two here in particular, they range the pieces that he makes in size. Obviously, the one outside the Carnegie is much taller, but these were 15 feet tall, and the steel was 2 inches thick, solid steel. So each one of these pieces weighed literally tens of tons. They're very, very heavy pieces. In fact, the MoMA Museum, before this retrospective, 2007, had a new addition put into the museum that was specifically made to carry the weight of his pieces, because they wanted to show his pieces within inside the museum. Typically, in most cases, his stuff is installed outside because the interior floors of the structures can't handle the weight. So these two ellipses really caught my eye as far as these concepts I was wrestling with as far as visual perception of form. And the first piece here was intriguing because the walls, these steel pieces leaned inward, and so when these both had slots where you could walk inside and get inside the piece. It was just one kind of C-shaped piece. This one, when you would go inside, because the walls leaned in, it kind of had an enclosing feel that made you feel like you were that the space was confined, very sheltered. This one, by contrast, when you went inside, because it was leaning out, had a much more open feel. But more importantly, these two pieces, he did something he hadn't done previously on any of his other work, and because he had forms that leaned inward and outward and elliptical in shape. But these two pieces, he put a slight curvature on them, and you can see it here, where the pieces had a bow to them. In this case, if you're standing inside the piece, it has a convex curve to it. And that subtle curve movement, again, harking back to my thesis, where it was just subtle manipulations of form, not real dramatic, had a very strong impact on the way that this form was perceived. Because by doing this, that subtle curve, when you were standing inside, the piece almost felt like it was kind of falling away in gesture form. And as you looked up to the top, your eye naturally was drawn to the top of the piece. It felt like as if it was just lifting up and it was floating away or in flight, like the steel was in flight. And by doing so, one of the things that whenever you experience Sarah's work in person is you're immediately aware of the immense weight of this steel. And a lot of his pieces involve that concept of perception of weight. But all of his pieces prior to that, you're absolutely aware of it. The texture, the surface, the thickness of these pieces. There's no mistaking it, and you almost perceive it and feel it just getting close to the piece. You can perceive its weight. But this particular, for the first time, I didn't feel that weight. It felt light. It was almost weightless, just by that simple gesture of that curvature. And so by altering the form, he was able to transform the perception of the material and the perception of the piece. And so that was a real kind of watershed moment for me in understanding how form can be manipulated.
How did they actually shape this?
It's interesting. I saw his work when I was out in Los Angeles as well at the Contemporary Museum out there years prior. And when I went to see it, he was in the space up on the balcony kind of watching the way people moved in and around the pieces. And which I thought was pretty cool that he was there, and he was very much interested in how people responded to the piece, how they moved about it and their reaction and that type of thing. So I approached him to compliment him on his work, but also to ask him a few questions, and he was like very receptive, very humble, laid-back person. And so then he explained, one of the questions I had was that exact question: how did he make these? And he used this process, this Asian water technique that he described, where they have large sheets of steel, single pieces, and that also drives where he can fabricate these. There's only a few mills in the world, Pittsburgh being one of them. He also fabricates some of these in Germany and various places that are large enough to handle the size of some of these pieces that he creates. But then once they're laid out, he'll then use this water technique he described, where the steel is heated, and then the water is kind of dripped across it in like a linear pattern, and the steel heated in response to the water that's kind of put on it very quickly and abruptly, like that quick cooling causes the steel to bend and to, suppose one side will be in more tension than the back side that's not getting wet. And so that curvature then is a result of, whereas, traditional means of flat steel is rolled, is a form that's been used to create these forms. And at one point he did that early on, but he's kind of switched at one point to this water technique to create these curvatures.